Whoa.
התקווה.
המסדר ידגל את נשקו. דגל, שק!
Thank you, Mr. Dawson. That was the Israeli national anthem. I've never heard it before. So we played that because today is the anniversary of the modern state of Israel. And as that is a very important topic, both for political and conspiracy theory people, it's a fitting topic for today. And we are going to discuss it in this roundtable edition of the Roundtable Podcast. I am Sir Galahad. Thank you, everyone, for joining me live today and on our YouTube and podcast channels. Please find the Roundtable Discord server by Googling Roundtable Discord or going to Disboard and finding us through politics or conspiracy theory sections. You can also join us on the roundtablediscord.com, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and all social media. So please do meet up with us. This is where all the magic happens. Also, a happy birthday to the one and only NSA Watches Me Jack Off. Today, they will watch him jack off on his birthday. So happy birthday, sir.
Yeah, I'm 34. I live Jesus. Fuck all y'all.
That's right. And cheers, L'chaim, to new beginnings. So today we will discuss Israel. It's a roundtable format, meaning everyone will get a turn on the mic when they want it. Just speak up when you're ready for your turn. You will then have as long as you want to speak on the topic with no time limits. And after everyone has had one full turn, we will conclude the episode. Unless that goes so quickly that we decide to do a little more. But in theory, everyone will get at least one turn. And nobody should speak twice until everyone has spoken once, unless everyone is finished that doesn't want to finish. So, Israel. I am not an expert in Israel. I have listened to a good podcast series about the formation of Israel by Dan Carlin, which was interesting, and I might go into a bit later. I'm hoping other people have more to say. Obviously, Israel is a powerful and wealthy nation that is almost certainly in possession of unofficial nuclear weapons. They are the Jewish homeland, the only Jewish state. Obviously, the history of Zionism and Judaism goes all the way back to the Bible. The destruction of the first and second temples, the loss of the Jewish homeland in ancient times, the diaspora, their imprisonment in Babylon, their freeing by Darius the Great, who is actually known as the Messiah, interestingly enough, in Jewish thinking. Persian guy. And yeah, obviously after World War II, the modern state of Israel was reestablished. The Holocaust was obviously used as a justification for its necessity. The Bible determined its borders, and it created a very difficult political point with Palestine that continues into the current times. There was the 7 Days War when many different Muslim nations came together to try and destroy Israel, sometimes described as a miracle that they failed because against overwhelming odds, at least from what I've heard, the Jewish military somehow triumphed. They do have very modern and powerful military. They have mandatory military service. America gives them millions of dollars every year in aid. Evangelical Christians often support Israel. Even I gave a $500 donation to Israel at one time, which was used to provide drinking water for Ethiopian Jews. But there's a verse in the Bible that says, "He who blesses Israel shall be blessed, and he who curses Israel shall be cursed." And people think that Jesus will come back in Jerusalem. So it's all very interesting. Meanwhile, Muslims sometimes believe that the Dajjal or Antichrist will actually be the Jewish Moshiach or Messiah. Christians sometimes believe this too. So it's all this big tangled web of who is the Antichrist, who is the Messiah. It all centers around Israel and Jerusalem. So I think that's all I wanted to say. I'll make that my turn. And I'm hoping someone else will step up next. Is anyone ready?
What a story, dude. Fucking thousands of years in the making, so many books and long-haired dudes. Yeah, man. I mean, I don't know, dude. There's all kinds of shit going on. There's so much controversy with Israel, too. I mean, so from an American perspective, we have a couple, like, negatives, right, that fuel anti-Semitism, is whatever you want to call it. I don't think it fuels anti-Semitism. I think it fuels anti-Zionism, but that's, me and Robert Seale's ideology. Like the USS Liberty situation, dancing Israelis outside 9/11, AIPAC's influence on our politicians, a lot of nasty things going on with the occupation is being suppressed and not really talked about and things like that. So, I mean, Israel is one of the American intelligence community's biggest ally. They're not in a Five Eyes arrangement necessarily, but basically CIA and Mossad are at the hip. Like, they're effectively one and the same, as far as I'm concerned. But there's a lot of weird stuff going on. Like, they want to impose will on Americans and then tell Americans not to protest them. And then if you do protest them, you're anti-Semitic. I just posted a video too, by the way. And this is an effort not to downplay the Israelites. I don't have anything against Jewish people, but the Israeli minister just comes out and says that we always use the anti-Semitism trick or bring up the Holocaust whenever any of our things are questioned. This is the Israeli minister saying it in the 90s. So, I mean, these things are known to people, and we're using. They've gotten us into a lot of conflict over there too. Like, they're trying to get us into Iran conflicts while they're exacerbating the conflict with Iran because they're fueling the fight between them. They're working with the Saudis extensively. There's all kinds of crazy shit going on in regards to Israel and the American interventionism that we've seen. And to speak out against it is apparently you can't even discuss it, or you become some dissident, when it's more like, no, let's be truth about it and stop playing this game like the American people are stupid, and we're not racist either. Like, it's not even about that. Now, I do believe that unfortunately the racism thing can be fueled very easily by online. I actually watched an FBI summit on anti-Semitism a couple months ago. It's 8 hours long. At the end of it, the Israelis asked the FBI, so why do you think anti-Semitism is on the rise in America? And they specifically said it's not on the rise, it's the increase in reporting. So now that reporting you have to watch for, because that reporting can get confused. You can make a bot go to every chat room in YouTube and start saying, all kinds of slurs all day, and that could be increased reporting. So it's a wild world out there, and I just don't like seeing racism being used as a weapon of divide and conquer, and I want to point out the congruities between it, because Benjamin Netanyahu, for example, he's very close friends with the leader of evangelist groups in the United States. There's 60 million evangelists in the United States. And the evangelists believe that the Bible is the Word of God, and the one true Word of God, and everything in it's factual and whatever else. So they like to use that to the evangelists to point out that in the Bible it does say Israel is the one city chosen by God and all this other stuff. So there's all kinds of prophetic cult-like, ideologies being utilized on the back end for a lot of the social structures between America and Israel. I wish we could just all get along and not have to deal with this fucking coy bullshit and, bring about a world order with truth and freedom and honesty. But these people want to play this fucking holy war bullshit still. And I'm a firm believer in ISIS, and a lot of terrorist shit going on is a big fucking intelligence operation between CIA, Mossad, MI6, etc., to fuel the military-industrial complex that works between the two. If you guys are aware, Israel has a large security firm, intelligence firm. Their intelligence, their technological intelligence is very good. They have something called Unit 8200, which is their NSA. They got all kinds of private firms that do. They make all the scanners for checkpoints and stuff like that. There's a lot of Israeli firms that do a lot of high-end things that the world uses. So, interesting times. Anyway, anybody else?
Yeah, I have something to say. Yeah, I think it's very. To me, I have a lot of respect for the Jews and what they were able to accomplish because, as someone, if you look at the various lands, across the world and the holiest cities according to various religions, excuse me, all the major religious cities, let's say for the Christians, Constantinople is occupied by Muslims. Lahore, holiest city for Sikhs, occupied by Muslims. Um, Same with the Hindus. Most of the Indus Valley civilization is occupied by Muslims. So it's very admirable what the Jews have accomplished, which the Christians, the Sikhs, and the Hindus haven't been able to accomplish, which is they were able to take back land that has been occupied by Muslims for over 1100 years. And to me, that's just, when they say that they're God's chosen people and you see what they have done, it's hard to refute that. They're completely outnumbered against against like a billion people. And the Holy War of 1967, where they were able to defeat the entire Arab world, it's a miracle. So I have nothing but respect for them. I yield my time.
Thank you. That was an interesting take. Is anyone else ready for turn on the microphone and speak about Israel from any angle whatsoever? Within respective rules, of course. Going once, going twice. Does anyone want to say anything about Israel?
I'll say a few things. Obviously, I think the founding of Israel was a overall positive for that region and for the Jewish people. I am hesitant about the future, though, because the problem in Israel is that you have a growing ultra-Orthodox population that doesn't join the military, and it's going to be interesting to see how, with a higher birth rate, how the more religious population, how they either integrate or don't integrate within the larger, more secular population. So that's going to be interesting to see. With the new government of Israel, which was just confirmed in the past week or so, how they're going to deal with relations with the Palestinians, especially because now they want to extend annexation to start with to the Jordan Valley. So that's going to be, in my opinion, there's rocky roads ahead for both the U.S. and Israeli relationship, but also for Israelis living in Israel.
They got music like a infected mushroom coming out of Israel. There's all kinds of stuff going on there right now. Have you seen the Egypt?
Let's see if anyone else wants a turn before we go back to second turns. I don't know if anyone else is going to go, but does anyone else want to say anything about Israel before we go back to open discussion, I guess?
I could say a few things.
Sure, I'd like to say a few words, Sir Galahad.
You're a little bit quiet, but please go ahead, Aziz. If you could just speak up, that'd be great.
Sure. Sorry about that. Yeah, I'm not an expert on the history of the state of Israel, and I'll just point out a few highlights, from a historical and as well as a little bit of an Islamic and somewhat of a Jewish perspective as well too. Um, so, uh, so the Jews were actually ruling that land as the Kingdom of Judah, at the time of Jesus the Messiah, and that was sort of the end of their reign. Even Jesus the Messiah, peace be upon him, he predicted that the temple would be destroyed, or that for the rebellion of the Jews, that they would be put into exile, and that happened in the year 70 A.D. With the Romans, and I believe it was under an individual named Titus, if I recall correctly. But so, the kingdom of Judah was destroyed, and the Jews were put into exile at that point, and the temple was destroyed as well. Um, so at that point, the dominion or ownership of that land transferred over to, I think it was a series of Christian kingdoms. So basically, the Christians, or well, actually, I'm sorry, no, it wasn't Christian initially. Initially, it was pagan with Roman, but then the Roman Empire became Christian later on. So initially it was like, but it was still under Rome. So it was under Rome, initially pagan, then Christian, until Muslims conquered it in the year 600, and I don't know, I think it was like the middle 600s, or I don't remember the exact year. Um, I think both, but what's interesting though is that both Christians and Jews agree that the Jews were put into exile, and so like, but the difference between the perspective is that Jews do not consider that exilic period to have started due to rejecting Jesus. So they attribute it to other causes. So, like baseless hatred among themselves, or, they'll say other things like, they were divided, and maybe they were committing sins or whatever the case was. And then the Christian and Islamic perspective would say that, it was that, yes, that was there as well, but it was also rejecting Jesus that led them into exile. In any case, the Muslims conquered the territory in, I think, the mid 600s. From It was from a Christian kingdom. And you know what was interesting though? Actually, when the Muslims conquered that land, it was actually better for the Jews because the Christians didn't allow the Jews to, make pilgrimage there. They didn't. In fact, the Temple Mount was being used as like basically like a landfill or like a garbage dump or something. And so the Muslims were shocked when they were like, oh, okay. So they decided to clean it up. And they built Masjid al-Aqsa not directly on the site, but adjacent to the site, I believe. So I'm sure you've seen pictures like where you see that mosque with the golden dome. That's not Masjid al-Aqsa. That's the Dome of the Rock. That's a different mosque that was built by a later Umayyad caliph. I don't know, perhaps maybe 100 years later or something. Well, it may not be 100 years, but I forget how many. It was less than a century later, but that was built by a different Umayyad caliph. But the original Masjid al-Aqsa, which is built under the auspices of the second caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, so that was adjacent to that site. And I'm not sure if Jews were allowed to return to live in the Holy Land at that point when it transferred to Muslim control. I'm not sure about that, but I do know that they were allowed to return for pilgrimage. They were allowed to come back to their site, and they have the Wailing Wall site there and whatnot, and some of the other holy sites of their um, that are relevant to Judaism. And so it remained in Muslim hands for several centuries. And so all the way up until 1948, I believe, the founding of the state of Israel, with the exception of the Crusader era. So there was a series of crusades. I don't, like I said, I'm not a historian. I don't know all the details, but um, I think the Crusaders, it might be accurate to say they maybe roughly a century they controlled the Holy Land. I might be off by, some years. So, please don't jump on me for, I don't know if it's plus or minus 50 years or something like that, but at least, or maybe you could think at least a century. And then it was reconquered by Muslims under Saladin or Salahuddin. So you can think basically from like the mid 600s all the way up until 1948, it was controlled by Muslims with the exception of the Crusader era, which is maybe a century or maybe add a few years to that. Um, and then the founding of the State of Israel. Now, like I said, I don't know all the details of the history of Zionism. I think Zionism really started taking off, or the idea of Zionism was to create a Jewish homeland for the Jews. And I think it really took off in the late 1800s. It might be older than that. Um, but Christian Zionism is much older than Jewish Zionism, as I've been told, or as I've read. So the evangelical Christian idea is that the Jews must return to the Holy Land, and their return to the Holy Land and the rebuilding of the third temple would actually usher in the Messianic age, and that would sort of, in a way, speed up the timeline and help Jesus to come back quickly. That's sort of the evangelical Protestant view of it. Orthodox Christians, interestingly enough, I actually talked to an individual about this in another server, and I didn't know this, but they have a totally different view of that. So they think that that's actually a satanic project, and so in Christian theology, there is, and in Islamic theology, there is the concept of the return of Christ and the return of, but before Christ's coming, there is an antichrist, false Messiah figure. And in both Christian and Islamic theology, the Antichrist, false Messiah, will be, misleading people. He'll be claiming to be God. He'll be, working corruption in the land, and basically people of no faith or weak faith or whatnot will follow him. Um, and I talked to a Jew about this, so I don't know if they have, it might be the case. I don't know if they have a clear idea of the Antichrist. They are certainly awaiting a Messiah because they were expecting a Messiah to be like the King of Israel. But when Jesus came, as far as the Jews were concerned, Jesus wasn't he wasn't the Messiah, and they also, and Jews actually believed that the crucifixion is one of the proofs that he was not the Messiah. Because if he were the Messiah, why would he be killed and why would he be hung up on a cross? And I think even in the Old Testament, it's considered to be like the person who's hung up is like cursed or whatever. So the crucifixion in the mind of Jews is like proof that Jesus was a false Messiah. So they're still waiting for like the real Messiah to come. I don't know if they have a clear idea of an anti-Messiah or antichrist or like false Messiah figure. So the question is, so I'm not sure, if they don't have a clear idea, then there is the danger that if the Christian and Islamic view is correct, that when the false Messiah comes first, there is a possibility that many Jews will falsely accept him as the real Messiah. They'll because they are waiting for the Messiah, right? And so when the false one comes, there is a good chance that many of them, I wouldn't say all. I don't believe that all Jews will follow the Antichrist, even as a Muslim. I don't think that, I do believe that there are good Jews out there. There are people of faith. There are people who have, there are Jews who have a good fundamental good nature out there. But yeah, there are many Jews that are corrupt. There are many Jews that are atheists. There are many Jews that kind of go through the motions of celebrating the Jewish holidays or whatever, but they don't even believe in God. They do it for cultural reasons, and they'll openly admit this to you. Many of them will tell you that, like, I don't believe in God. So I'm assuming, I'm pretty much 100% sure that any atheist, quote unquote, Jew would definitely follow the Antichrist. But Orthodox Christians, actually, it's very interesting when you talk to them. They believe that the Antichrist will set up his kingdom in Jerusalem, or in the Holy Land, and it will be the Jews who actually follow him. So as the false, or they'll be tricked into following him. So that's an interesting take, but that's very different than the evangelical Christian perspective. They're trying to help this process along to bring Jesus back as quick as possible. So that's sort of their motivation, which is interesting. Any case, but. So I think that gets to the point that evangelical Christianity has been, in many ways, Zionist longer than the Jews have. But in the late 1800s, they started developing this idea, and what's interesting is they consider different possibilities. So again, you guys can correct me afterwards if I make any mistakes. I apologize. I haven't prepared this or anything, so if any of my details are wrong, I apologize. But I think they consider Madagascar as a possibility, and there's a few other possibilities they were floating as sort of as a homeland for the Jews. And had they done that, things probably would have worked out perfectly fine. I mean, well, barring any socio-political, problems in the region, but the thing is, one of the reasons why, but there was a debate among Zionists, and one of the reasons that they did settle on the Holy Land was that they would have biblical and historical support for their claim. So they could claim, well, I mean, in the case of Madagascar, well, when did the Jews live there? So how much, how strong of a claim do you have? And then you don't have the Bible to back you up. But in the Holy Land, they could say, hey, our ancestors lived here from this time to this time. The Bible says God gave us this land, so we have more support. So I think they ended up, choosing the Palestine for that, and also because they could get evangelical Christian support for that claim as well. Um, but what was fascinating though, one of the problems though, was that it was actually against Judaism, and so think about this. For centuries and centuries, the Jews never made a concerted attempt to, reestablish themselves in the Holy Land. There weren't even like movements. Now you could say, well, they were blocked from doing it for political reasons, and I understand that counter argument. But the thing is, there isn't even evidence of them trying until I think the 1800s, until the late 1800s. So the question is, why did the Jews not try to reestablish a homeland until the late 1800s? And when you actually study Judaism, you realize the reason was Judaism. So according to traditional Orthodox Torah Judaism, Jews, when they were put into exile, they were not allowed to take themselves out of exile until they got permission from God, or until they got a sign from God. And one of the major interpretations of that was that they would have to wait for the Messiah to come. There are other interpretations, I think, as to how that would occur. But it's interesting when you take a look at the restoration of the exile of the Jews from the Babylonian exile, which occurred in the 500s, roughly BCE or BC, right? Let me just actually backtrack a little bit. So going back in time to the Jewish era, roughly in the year 500 something BC. There was the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, which is like sort of this southern Iraqi kingdom, attacked and destroyed the kingdom of Judah and put the Jews into exile, and they took them into slavery. And so there was an exilic period in what is modern day Iraq and Babylonia. I think it was maybe 70 years ish, something. I could be wrong on that, but and then what happened was that Cyrus the Great, of Persia, actually conquered that territory, and so the Jews, their political domination transferred from the Babylonians to the Persians. And once that did, their fortunes improved because Cyrus was much more sympathetic to them. And the Jews also made repentance, and they realized that they had committed crimes and whatnot. And that's why God had dispossessed them from the land. And so then they had a restoration under King Cyrus. And you could read about it in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah in the Old Testament, where but the thing is, this process was done by believing Jews. These were not atheists. They were under the guidance of prophets and holy men of God and priests and things like that. And there's that whole story of how they restored themselves and their kingdom was restored. Now fast forward to the late 1800s. um, and you have this Jewish belief among many Jews and among religiously observant Jews that sorry, let me clear my throat here. That they were not allowed to come out of exile until they got a sign from God. So Judaism was one of the biggest stumbling blocks to Zionism. But the thing is, the Zionists, they were, and most Christians don't know this. The early Zionists were atheists. They were,
Aziz, I don't know if it's just my end, but you're inaudibly quiet. If there's anything you can do to be louder, please do. I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Not very well. Yes.
Okay. Should I just let me try?
I can hear you okay now. Just anything you can do to be loud and close to the mic, but I can hear you. Sorry. Thank you.
Okay, I appreciate it. It's my microphone on this phone, so I apologize for that. I'll try to speak a little louder. So yeah, it was interesting. So when you look at the history, look at people like Vladimir Jabotinsky and I don't remember Theodor Herzl. There's many more. I don't know all the history, but they were all avowed atheists, and they had to be because they had to go against Judaism in order to create the state of Israel. These were people that were like barely connected to their faith, and in some sense it's understandable because the thing is like the Jews were in exile for so many centuries. They were spread around the world. Oftentimes they were oppressed. They were oppressed by Christians in Europe. Sometimes they were oppressed by Muslims as well. I think Muslims overall treated the Jews better than the Christians did. If you look at history, there are Jewish communities throughout the Middle East, Morocco, Yemen, Iraq, all over in many Muslim countries. And overall, I would say throughout history, Muslims did treat the Jews better, but I'm sure at times they were discriminated against or they were oppressed. And so when you're kind of this like small community that's like all over the world, sort of like nomads, and people push you around, you don't have a national language, you don't have a national sports team, you don't have like scientific achievements. Like the French can be proud of their scientific achievements, the British can be proud of their scientific achievements, their military prowess, colonialism, or whatever. um, you have your own, like, your country's culture, American culture, Canadian culture, German culture, whatever, or Russian or whatever it is. People can be proud of their ethnicity, their nationality, but the Jews didn't have that because they didn't have a state. And so, and for many Jews, that really, really grated on their mind. They didn't like the fact that from a secular political or a worldly perspective, they were the underdogs. They did not like that at all. And they said, why is it that every country has their own country? Why is it the French have France, the British have, the UK? People can be proud of their nationality, but we can't because we don't even have a state. And that's what we want. And so it was basically a secular worldly considerations, and that's what they and the Zionists, they had that burning desire to, to be on the world stage and to be proud of who they were as a nationality, not as a religious group, but as a nationality. And so those are some of the strong currents that fed into Zionism, where they felt that they really had to have a state. In any case, the project continued, and so there was debates among them, and they finally settled on Palestine. And what ended up happening now at this time, the Palestine was controlled by, or that territory, it wasn't a country. There was no, in some sense, when the Jews say that there's no country of Palestine, in some sense, maybe I think they are correct in that there wasn't like an independent country called Palestine. It was controlled by different, Muslim empires. So, for like hundreds of years, it was actually under the Ottomans. So it was a province within the Ottoman Empire, right? It wasn't like its own country, Palestine, but it was controlled, by Muslims. And then in the late 1800s, 1900s, the Ottoman power was like weakening, and then finally the Ottoman Empire collapsed in after World War One. So that was sort of the end of Muslim hegemony of that Holy Land, and from there it transferred to the British. So it came under the British mandate, and at this time the Zionists were actually increasing immigration to the land, and so they were starting to trickle in. After World War One, they had more immigration. And then, of course, after World War II, with Hitler and Nazism and stuff, you had a huge exodus of Jews, and many of them, came to the land of Palestine. But in any case, that was all possible under the British mandate, because regulations were more relaxed and things like that, and so at that time they were kind of building their state. They actually they imported arms and whatnot, and I think they became armed in that area. But what's fascinating is that a lot of the rabbis around the world, I think the chief rabbi of Jerusalem, in Iraq, and in Baghdad, and other rabbis actually condemned Zionism as a heresy because according to their religious beliefs they were not allowed to do that. But the early Zionists, they weren't religious Jews. Most of them were atheists, and so they believed in an ethno-nationalist vision of their country, and so they were building up. And I think finally, I don't know all the details, but eventually somehow they managed to like push out the Arabs from certain areas, and they declared the state of Israel, and then they were recognized by many countries and whatnot. And so the state of Israel was founded. Again, I may have a lot of the details off. I don't know all those details. But yeah, so the state of Israel was founded in 1948, but yeah, we just have to remember that initially it started as as an atheist project, and now again, so now religious Jews have there are religious Jews in Israel as well too, so there is a religious element to it. But when you talk to Israelis, it's interesting. They'll say that Israeli society is very, very secular, probably, and I would say even more secular than Jewish communities outside of Israel. So if you look at the Jews in New York and Brooklyn and whatnot, I think they're much more religiously observant and believing than even people in Israel. So I'm trying to think if there's any other points I want to talk about. The state of Israel, maybe a few. This is not really super relevant to the point, but there was also like a restoration of the Hebrew language and stuff, like a modern Hebrew language, which is not exactly biblical Hebrew. It's close in many ways, but there are differences. So, if you understood modern Hebrew, it would not be you would not be able to fully understand the Old Testament, the Bible, the Tanakh, in the biblical Hebrew, but it would help you to understand it. It's kind of like how colloquial Arabic is, like Egyptian colloquial, or different types of colloquial Arabic is maybe sort of to classical Arabic, where you can understand the Quran somewhat, but you wouldn't have a full understanding of it. But that language was resurrected because a lot of the Jews in the diaspora, they would speak the local language. They did have some like a variation like Yiddish, which is, I think, it was like a combination. It was like a combination of Hebrew and maybe German. I forget. I apologize if I totally screwed that up. But but oftentimes Jews would speak the local language of the community they were in, but they would maintain the biblical Hebrew as a liturgical language. So something that they would read the scripture in, and in their services they would use that type of biblical Hebrew. But it wasn't like an everyday spoken language. So modern Hebrew was sort of like sort of put together and resurrected as sort of like a spoken language for the Jews in the state of Israel, because they wanted to have a national language, and so that became that. And now that part I'm not against. I don't have a problem with resurrecting a language and speaking it. If I were them though, I would have tried to make the modern Hebrew as close to the biblical Hebrew as possible, just to be connected to the scripture. But whatever. I mean, it is what it is. Um, I'm trying to think. So we covered that. State of Israel modern. Oh, okay. One last thing I'll say. Just from a Muslim perspective too. Now, obviously, look, we all have different perspectives on this. As a Muslim, I'm going to say that I think Muslims should be ruling the Holy Land, and of course, I think that Jews should be allowed to live there and make pilgrimage there. But I do think it should be under the dominion of Muslims. You guys as Christians, most of you would probably disagree and say that, well, we think it should be under, Christian domination, or some Christians have taken the position that it should be internationally administered. Like that are I'm talking about non-Zionist Christians, that it should be like a UN administered. That's another position. Obviously, the evangelical like type of Christians that are the Zionist Christians, they are 100% in favor of the Jews and the Israelis. So they would say no, it should be under the control of the Jews, and this is part of the end times, fulfillment. So they have a different perspective. Um, but I will say this though, it's not when you look at the sort of the last thing I'll say is when you look at the behavior of Muslims though, we've made a lot of mistakes as well too. I mean, the Muslim world in the early 20th century was beset by all kinds of deviant ideologies, communism, nationalism, and many Muslims actually moved towards atheism in the early 20th century. A lot of people don't know this. So from our perspective, when you are moving towards atheism, communism, and all these ridiculous nonsense ideologies, why would Allah help you? Why would you merit and deserve the help of Allah? And not only that, Muslims are also very disunited. There were Arab revolts against the Ottoman Empire, so it's really funny. So a lot of the Arabs in the region were like, "Oh, we're going to free ourselves from the yoke of these like oppressive Ottomans." They kicked off the Ottomans, and within a few decades, what happened? They became like the victims of colonialism. It's kind of like serves you right. Like you thought that you were going to kick out other Muslims and do your own thing, and then somebody else came and kicked you out. So it's like it's sort of like karma, in some sense. But and by the way, I'm not Turkish either, so I'm not like saying this from a Turkish perspective. But yeah, and there is and also when you look at the Palestinians, I mean, there's definitely good, but there is right now. Well, politically, they're split into two factions. So you have like the PL, I think the remnants or whatever the successor of the PLO is. I don't know what they're called nowadays. The Palestinian Authority. I'm not sure what they call themselves, but they're in the West Bank, and then it's totally separated from Gaza, which is on the west side, and Gaza is a they actually had elections, and Hamas won, which is an Islamist group. It's kind of related to the Muslim Brotherhood. It's sort of a derivative of the Muslim Brotherhood in some ways. I think they came to power, but they were kicked out of the. I think they won the elections, but they were kicked out of the West Bank, if as I recall. And so I think they maintained power in Gaza. They're totally separated. So you basically nowadays have two political entities. You've got a Hamas-ish Gaza little strip there that's attached to Egypt, but that border is usually sealed. And then the Israeli border is sealed. So pretty much Gaza is an island. And then you've got the West Bank, which is controlled by the Palestinian Authority. It's a lot larger. It has better resources. It abuts Jordan. However, the West Bank is also totally cut up with a lot of, the Israeli border wall and things like that. So it's very difficult to move around in there because oftentimes you have to go like through very circuitous routes through many checkpoints and whatnot. So life there is not great. But some people, there are wealthy Palestinians as well. I mean, you'll find Palestinians living in mansions in the West Bank as well. So it's not like they're all poor. But there is definitely corruption among the Muslims in Palestine and Gaza. And as a Muslim, I would say that's the reason Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like God, does not help us to become victorious because we have our own corruption and problems as well. And then finally, the question is, what is the solution to Palestine and Israel? I don't know. I mean, people take different stances. Some people are like, we should just have a two-state solution. Some people take the stance we should have a one-state solution where all citizens are equal under Israeli authority. Some people take the stance that, we have to overthrow Israel. And some Muslims just throw up their hand. Well, we just have to wait for the Mahdi, and we just have to wait until Jesus comes back, and then he'll sort everything out. So there are a lot of different perspectives. I don't know what the solution is, but the one thing that I do know is that the state of Israel, as far as I'm concerned, is not legitimate, both from a Jewish, an Orthodox Christian, and an Islamic perspective. And that's the end of my statement. I'll turn it over to you guys.
Thank you, Aziz. That was very informative and extensive, and we appreciate that. It's excellent content. Is anyone else ready to speak about Israel from whatever angle or perspective you wish?
I'd like to say a few things.
Please go ahead.
There is a lot of forgotten history, I think, regarding Zionism. It did start up in the 1800s, like Aziz had said, but for a long time, Zionists were probably the most ferocious terrorists on the face of the earth, unfortunately. They were responsible for several assassinations, like the assassination of British Minister of the Mideast, Lord Moyne. They assassinated Count Bernadotte, the Swedish royal. They tried to assassinate Ernst Bevin. In fact, the two main Zionist groups, militant groups that would be considered terrorists by today's standards, were Lehi, also known as the Stern Gang, and the Irgun, IRGUN, and they even tried to, I believe it was Lehi, they didn't try, but they sent a package bomb to President Truman, which didn't detonate, thank God. They tried to, I think I said, tried to assassinate Ernest Bevin. I believe they were successful in assassinating the Dutch royal Jacob de Haan. They would often use car bombs in several cities. They would hijack buses and kill in Jerusalem, Syria, and in Britain. They hijacked buses in Jerusalem and Syria and Tel Aviv. They killed Arabs. There was one massacre known as the Deir Yassin massacre, where Jews, a group of 120 Jews, I believe it was the Irgun, they massacred over 600 villagers who were Palestinian. They were responsible for the several bombings of buildings. They tried to detonate a bomb in the colonial offices in London, other government buildings in London. They were successful in detonating a bomb within the Hotel King David. They also detonated a bomb in another hotel called the Semiramis Hotel, where they killed people. They detonated a bomb in Rome at the embassy, the British embassy in Rome. Let me think. What else? Am I coming through okay? I might be.
Yeah, you're fine.
Oh, okay, I thought I was glitching. Anyway, so there's a long history of terrorism with Zionism that started. I mean, Zionism started in the latter 1800s, but the terrorism didn't start until the early 1900s, and it extended all the way up until post World War II with the assassinations of several British ministers and such. So, I mean, it's kind of ironic, and maybe like a sort of collective karma, that now they have to deal with terrorism the way they do. I don't condone it. I don't think they deserve it. But it is ironic that now terrorism plagues Israel, the state. As somebody had said earlier that Christians never captured land back from the Muslims, I just like to remind that person of the Spanish Reconquista. The entire Balkans were once ruled over by Muslims, and the Balkan nations were able to free themselves, including Greece, which were able to find independence through struggle. And also, with regard to Israel, it wasn't really, the Jews themselves didn't actually free Israel from Muslim control. What they had done was lobbied. After the British had to deal with a lot of this terrorism, they were starting to become, tired of it, and they didn't know what to do. And several British lords, like Lords Rothschild, were lobbying other British lords for years. We know that through the Balfour Declaration, which was a famous letter from Rothschilds to several. I forget the exact person. It actually might have been from a minister of parliament to Lord Rothschild, but the context of the letter was regarding the creation of the state of Israel. So it was actually a UN resolution 1947 that decided to, at the behest of the British, who controlled Palestine under a mandate, to split Israel into two, one Arab state and one Jewish state. And that's the way it was supposed to be. But up until that time, Israeli, or Jews rather, had engaged in illegal immigration to the area. They were funneling people, because at the start of the 19th century, there was maybe 10% Jewish population there, maybe 15. By 1947, that had gone to about 70% through all the illegal immigration that Zionists were promoting. So after the UN resolution and the British handed over Israel to the Jews, from that point on, it was supposed to be a dual state, but it never came to fruition. And even today, the Jews still kind of, there are talks and supposedly, there was talks of dual state solutions, and Arafat supposedly turned down, something like 90% concessions, but he didn't want it. He wanted the 100% or whatever. And I hear stories like that, but I just don't think that a dual state solution will ever come to pass. And I fear for the survival of the Palestinians as a people. I just have a feeling that at this point, I don't think a dual state solution will ever happen. And I don't see the Palestinians being accepted to any of the surrounding Muslim countries because they don't want the trouble, as well as the fact that Palestinians who do relocate might be able to garner wealth and stability, and through that, kind of grow an irredentist movement where they might want to go back and challenge Israel's hegemony over the area. So I have a dark fear that the Palestinians may die out as a people in Israel, and they'll never be able to leave, and they'll never have a dual state solution. The other thing that I worry about with regard to Israel and the area is we've seen now that Golan, for the longest time, which was considered Syrian land and just occupied territory, is now annexed officially by Israel. And I think most people would agree that Israel is never going to give up the Golan, because the Sea of Galilee as a fresh water source is very important. So I don't think they ever had any plans to give up Golan, but now it's been officially annexed, as Gaza Strip might be as well. And the West Bank, I would say, is pretty much officially annexed, in that Israel has declared Jerusalem the capital of the state. Now, I was talking with a religious Jew, I think it was yesterday or the day before, and he says a large growing of Jews also support something known as the Greater Israel, or the like a sort of Halachian Greater Israel that will recapture the area once encompassed by the two kingdoms, and that would be from the Nile all the way to the Euphrates. So it would actually take part of Egypt, part of Iraq, and part of Syria. And a lot of Jews are starting to adopt this idea, this Megali idea, or this expansionist idea. And I fear that with that type of rhetoric and foreign policy, we'll never see any stability within the Levant, at least for decades, maybe even a century. And that's kind of what I'm afraid of. And the same guy yesterday who I was talking to said growing numbers of Jews also believe that the church land, like for instance, the Greek Orthodox Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is built around the sites where Jesus was crucified and also his tomb, that the Christians should not hold that land anymore, and the church should not be allowed to exist there, and that they should actually be, put out of the country and the church taken over into Jewish hands. And a lot of Jewish people, unfortunately, are also growing, their opinions are kind of veering towards that as well, where they think like it's just that Israel and the Jewish state should only be for Jews in Israel, and that Christians shouldn't hold holy sites, as Muslims shouldn't either. And then there was some legislation a couple of years ago, or maybe it was last year, regarding the state identity of Israel, where they actually signed into Israeli law that the state officially is a state for Jews by Jews. So it kind of put the Jewish ethnicity above all others, like in a first class citizenship, whereas everyone else would be considered second class. And I don't think these kind of policies are going to lead to any sort of stability or peace in the region, and that's what I'm afraid of. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if I disconnected. Does anyone else wish to speak?
Just want to ask a clarifying question. Has anyone spoken for the case of Israel?
Well, if anybody wishes to speak, the mic is open. Anyone who wants a turn to speak on whatever they want. Is there anyone else who would like a turn?
I can try. Is that okay?
Yes, exactly. It's an open mic. Your turn.
Okay, so I have to clarify that I'm a Hindu. I'm an Indian, and this entire debate for Israel and Palestine is kind of like I couldn't fall on either side. Just from from my background, it's because there's been Muslim occupation of India for a long time. Then there's also the British that backed Israel and made it a state, and so there's a conflict of interest there. So just want to put that out before I try to make the case. And the one I'm trying to make is basically on political and geographical grounds rather than the religious, which I'm not very aware of. So let's start with Israel being founded by Jews and Zionists, and then being there first. I mean, like this land. I posted a song. It's like this land is mine. It's a critique of it. It's basically this land has been throughout history. Everyone's trying to get it for one reason or another, and there's varying narratives as to why this land is important to them. But ultimately, you're looking at a war zone, and now that it is under Israeli, let's say, occupation. Okay, I think it's a bit facetious to say that they're wrong because it's just occupied, and the Palestinians had it for a while. But I mean, you can make the case that the Israelis had it before, or sorry, the Jewish people had it before, and now that someone has occupied it, it's going to like you can't make that moral case against, because that case can go both ways. If you look at the wars that it was in since its inception, right? The Israeli War of Independence, 47 to 49, the Midway, the reprisal operations, 50s and 60s. You're looking at, like, since its birth, it's got to be a military state. And if you look at the size of Israel, it's this tiny thing. You can't even see it, like distinguish it. It's a dot if you look at it like the global map. Anyways, you can continue. The Suez Crisis, the Six-Day War, the War of Attrition, Yom Kippur. The list kind of goes on and on. The Intifadas, Lebanon, Gaza, and these are, I believe, primarily wars where Israel was attacked. And the reason I point this out is to highlight the idea that Israel doesn't have a right to exist, which I would call into question only because of the amount of peace treaties that were actually. So, like the UN, for instance, right? The first major project it had was to find a solution, and obviously it didn't. But if you look at the amount of peace treaties that were proposed and obviously failed, are just like the cap. I mean, we're looking like like before even the establishment of the state, before the migrations and everything. There was always efforts to unite the Israeli claim and the Palestinians there. There was a fundamental disconnect on the religious grounds. But other than that, if you're just looking at geographically and politically, you're looking at a war zone. I don't think you can deny you can't deny either of the positions based on that idea. And I think the only way, because there's a fundamental disconnect in the religious fundamentalist grounds, this has to be a political solution. Because people's religious ideas can maybe lessen and fuse over time, but politics can change, and people can learn to live together. If you look at the diplomatic treaties, you're looking at Camp David. All the way until Trump, like recently. But every time that the peace was offered, there was always something that happened from the other side. And I'm not going to excuse that. Like if someone occupies my home and then is like, here's a peace treaty, I'm not going to accept it, right? But like that's their point of view. But every time the peace treaty has been offered, if you look at like the planning of the state of Israel, or let's say Palestine, you're going to see different, like it's cut up into like this pie. Imagine a pie with like blueberries, and the blueberries are like these provinces or areas where Jewish people live, and the rest of it is where Palestinians live. And over time, the state of Israel basically ossified and claimed more and more of this land and started to infringe into the Palestinian areas. But it's precisely because the peace treaties that were designed to make peace were never upheld by the Arab and the Palestinian side. And because I'm looking at it from the political side of view, I would say that that's a major consideration we should have, because the religious one is just unresolvable, in my opinion.
Can I say a couple words?
What's that?
Can I make?
Yeah, I'm done. I yield.
Yeah, so whoever's next.
Okay. I just wanted to preface by saying that I was raised in a Reformed Jewish household and exposed only to pro-Israel news and so on. I've learned a bit more about it since, and I tend to think that if we could have done it over, we should have put Israel in Madagascar, like some people were planning, to avoid the whole conflict. But I do think people are holding Israel to a different standard than they hold other countries because of the Jewish angle. And in most other situations, we more or less accept the conquest might be the right way of dividing the world. Almost all of the world is divided in such a way. And Israel's formation was fairly recent, but not especially so. So it's a bit strange to pick an arbitrary time and say all conquests beyond this point are illegitimate and all conquests prior to this point were legitimate. But of course, there have been more recent conquests that nobody talks about nearly as much as Israel. So that's all I had to say. Thanks.
Can I follow up with that? So, Gellert, I was okay. I wanted to point out that there's some exactly the point that you're trying to make. Like you can't treat like after this point, conquests are illegitimate or something, right? Because it's like it's been a tradition, and then somehow some governing body like Geneva Conventions comes and states that after this point, all of this is illegal. I mean, sure, as a world, we can come together and identify, rules of conduct, rules of warfare, and all of that. But in reality, these really don't exist. So, like, if your enemy breaks them, you have to do whatever it takes to overcome that. So, in light of that, I would say that Israel, you can't treat Israel to a different standard, and it's smaller. And even though Madagascar was promised to them, I I would still support the claim that to their to the Holy Land, so to say, but in a political union rather than like a religious claim. Um, if uh, if we look at like let's say the claims like most of the Palestinians actually moved to Jordan. Okay, Jordan consists of almost like I don't know. It's a high majority of Palestinians, and they refer to they go to the Dead Sea and they look at the other side and they say that's Palestine, and you're looking at that's Jordan on its own, but all of the other countries, with respect to the people in West Bank and Gaza, no Arab country is willing to accept any of the people there, even though they rather that they suffer in this basically they have their airspace is blocked. There's an embargo on their goods and stuff. There's boots on the ground, and basically really bad situations. They would rather keep them there just to have this cause, this so-called cause of like we object to the state of Israel. We would let these people suffer, but we're not going to be completely involved in it. We'll wait until some kind of tempers flare up. There's some really outlandish confrontation that warrants another war, and then once again some kind of skirmish happens, lots of lives are lost, and then a peace treaty comes again, and nothing is resolved. So like no one's willing to yield even an inch, and I think it started because Israel, by its definition, had to defend itself from all of these wars. It has never been like Israel goes and Israel, I admit, does infiltration in like very cryptically and in a very clandestine way. They would like this is a documented thing. They would go to the Palestinian areas, let's say in West Bank, how West Bank is shrinking, and they would supposedly send a research crew of like archaeologists, and they would find some Jewish artifact. They'd be like, well, this was part of Israel. So then that's part of Israel now. So like that's what's happening. But on the war front, especially on the military side, Israel has never been the first to strike. It's always been doing it in defense, but it is complex because it's like kind of like pressing someone to the wall, and then if they retaliate, you claim they've hit you, and then you declare war. But I mean, you can make that case, but you can't make that like for the Palestinians. You can't make that case for like Egypt. You can't make that case for all the other Arab countries that are around them. And I just object to the idea that a political resolution can't be met. But in order to do that, I think the Arab countries have to come in good faith, and if they really support the Palestinians, which they claim to do, but I think it's just for like that cause of we hate the state of Israel. They need to make it in good faith and apologize for starting the wars to begin with. That Israel had to defend themselves. That's it.
Yeah, I just want to kind of add some points, and I kind of left and came back to the conversation. See, and I think this was Aziz was talking about this earlier, but the reason why, like, I mean, I grew up in you can say quote unquote, it's a Christian non-denominational. You can say it's evangelical, but definitely pro Zionism. If you have they had the flag. I mean, I'm not part of that church anymore, but they had the flag of Israel flying outside the church. But the selling point really, and it's an accurate selling point to the Christians, is that our biggest enemy have always been the Muslims, just conquest, rape, and forced conversions. So we even had like Jewish, you can say rabbis or Messianic Jews, and even rabbis just come in and they would kind of teach the Christian population this history. And so this is kind of like some of the reasons, some of the valid reasons that Christians back Jews is because, okay, we can't have, so Christians are not going to have the Holy Land, but it's better that Jews hold the Holy Land compared to the Muslims who hold all of the holiest cities of all the religions. So I thought I mentioned that because it's just, to us, like, I mean, Muslims have been, genociding us for like ever since their religion was created. So it's very hard for us, to side with. It's not really like an enemy of my enemy situation, but it's just more like it's just very hard to side with Muslims on anything.
Well, then I'd like to offer a little rebuttal to that because I think the biggest mistake you're making with what you're saying is you're equating Palestinians with Muslims. And there are Palestinians who are Christians, and there also are Palestinians who practice Judaism, although there's a very small amount of those, tiny percentage. But the two, Palestinian and Muslim, are not the same. And even beyond that,
It's
I would like to not be interrupted, please.
sorry.
Even beyond that, the banner of Christianity is held up by many, many people, many walks of life that believe all sorts of different things. The same is true for Islam. The same is true for Judaism. And so there's a vast spectrum of different attitudes and beliefs and ideas under any one of those banners. And so there has been plenty of rape and conquest that has been perpetrated by people who are self-professed Christians through history. The same could be said of self-professed Israelites, Jewish people, and the same can be said of self-professed Muslims. So even beyond that, I just wanted to add that, some people are saying, well, we shouldn't, attack Israel verbally for doing things. The might makes right. They only are doing what other countries have been doing for thousands of years and taking over land. And, that idea is, in the 21st century, in the 20th century, might makes right, so whoever takes over wins. Well, Israel did not form in its present day configuration without any help. Great Britain was aided by other countries in planting the modern state of Israel there where it's at as a small seed, and they used military force to kick people out of their homes in order to make room for the incoming Jewish people. And so, if you're fine with that, because, whoever's the strongest should be the one who gets to have the land, then we're going to agree to disagree. But, I'm the first person to be sympathetic to arguments about Native Americans being warring for land before, Europeans ever started to come in great numbers. But that doesn't make Europeans right. It doesn't make the ones who were taking the land from their native brothers right. Just because you have the ability to overwhelm someone by force, that doesn't mean that you should automatically have a claim to the land. I don't jive with that. But the last thing I'll say here in closing on this little statement is that before the Jews that started the modern day Israel were planted there by the British close to 100 years ago, there were Christians, Muslims, and Jews living there in what is now the modern state of Israel in peace with each other. They actually had the keys to each other's houses and would watch each other's children on the holy days where their neighbors were at their worship services. And so, the idea that this is primarily a religious conflict, I do disagree with. I think that religion is a scapegoat that is used to excuse the actions of a minority who are bent on conquest and control and care little for the innocent people who are caught up in it as long as they get their way. So I'll go ahead and stop for now.
Yeah. See, Yeah, if I can just quickly respond, I guess you can make the claim that there are some Palestinian Christians, but it's the story of the Arab Christian is that century after century after century, you see the numbers dwindling, and it's because of terrorist acts. It's nothing more than that. I mean, we've seen we've seen with the early Islamic conquest to the latest quote unquote Islamic conquest or Islamic genocide on Christians in Libya and Syria. Um, it's just you can say, okay, there's some Christians alive there, they're Palestinian, but it's just like, okay, can you guarantee based on historical records that they'll be there in 50 years? I doubt it. They'll have to either somehow escape to the West, or they'll have to see. It's a thing, and you kind of painted this fantasy of like, oh yeah, at some point they were all like living peacefully with each other. See, for the Christian, it's like it's like a Jew living next to a Nazi. Yeah, maybe he's fine one day, but you know that he hates you, and at some point, based on history, he's probably going to come to your house with a gun or a sword, and that's just the history of Christians versus Muslims. It's just, and it's just foolish to propose that you can live in peace with people who want to kill you and who have consistently killed you for the past 1,000 years.
I'd like to also say something if I can.
I yield my time.
Can you guys hear me okay? Hello?
Yeah.
I hope you guys can hear me. There's a lot of lost history too regarding the Palestinians, because calling, as one gentleman said, calling the Palestinians Arabs or Muslim, even Muslim, neither are correct, because there are Palestinian Christians that have been
Can't
Christian.
hear you, Nero.
Can you hear me better now or no?
You're still low.
Let me see if I could.
I don't know, Noro. I hear you like perfectly clear over here.
Yeah, same. You sound just fine.
Okay, well, Palestinians, they're Christian Palestinians that have been Christian since the Byzantine age. They've converted to Christianity along with the Greek Byzantines, and Palestinians themselves, although they're a Semitic people, they're technically not Arab. And the history of the Palestinian people has kind of been buried and obfuscated and kind of even revised to fit. Again, it's one of the negative, because I tend to bring up, everyone is bringing up the positive, so I'll be the devil's advocate and bring up the negative aspects of Zionism. But the word Palestinian, the ethnonym Palestinian, comes from the Latin Palestina, which actually comes from the Greek Palestine, and the Greek comes from the Hebrew Pelesheth. Pelesheth in Hebrew is actually the ethnonym for Philistine. It means, Pelesheth itself actually means Philistine, the land of the Philistine people. And if you want to be technical, the Philistines were in Canaan, were in that area prior to Jewish arrival. The Jews actually wrangled control of the land from the Philistines in wars that had started in the 1300s BC. So the Palestinian people have just as much right to that area as the Jewish people. And now I don't think the state of Israel should dissipate. I believe the state of Israel has the right to exist. I don't think Jews should be displaced. They're there. They're there now. They have a strong state. They have the right to exist, and we should support them. But we should also support Palestinians and understand that although they're engaging in terrorism, which is wrong, the Zionists, as I had said before, also engaged in close to half a century or more of terrorism themselves in order to push for the state of Israel. So the terrorism we see now from Palestinians is very akin or very similar to the terrorism we saw in the early 1900s up until about 1947 from the Zionists, who were trying to create or push for the creation of the state of Israel. And to say that, you want to talk about double standards, where we kind of have a double standard there, because we've buried the history of Zionist terrorism, and yet we constantly, barrage people with stories of Palestinian terrorism, which are true. I mean, the Palestinians, without a doubt, have engaged in terrorism, but I would say more terrorism was perpetuated by groups like Hamas, who aren't Palestinian, who are actually funded by an American ally in the United Arab Emirates, and the Hezbollah, who were funded by Iranians. So a lot of the time we center on the PLO and the other, terrorists in Gaza and stuff like this, but it's not just Palestinians who are engaging in terrorism. In fact, their acts of terrorism have been much lesser than these other two groups I mentioned. And they are engaging in the same exact tactics that Zionists engaged in for over half a century. And I just think that it's important to remember the origin, to preserve the etymology, and to stop the revisionism that's going on, because the revisionism from a lot of these Zionist scholars even is trying to change world history, where now there's this push to try to equate the ancient Philistines to Greeks, which is ludicrous in my opinion, because the Philistines predate the Greeks by hundreds of years. And even by the time they were warring with the Israelites, the Greeks had still not coalesced. They had just, we're going back to Minoan times, and they find, bits of, one gentleman was talking about pottery that Jews find and say, oh, well, this must have been part of Israel. Well, they do the same with Philistine. They found Luwian pottery, which is most likely from a group related to the Hittites in Anatolia, but they claim, oh no, because it's similar to Greek, because they traded with the Pelasgians early on, that pottery has Greek characteristics, but it's not Greek. And because they find, bits and pieces that were probably acquired through trade in Syria and northern Israel, they say, oh, the Philistines must have been Greek, so they weren't Palestinian at all. Well, that's not true, because the Greeks didn't even exist yet. But it's this sort of revisionism that's trying to displace or uproot Palestinian history, Palestinian claim to the land, and the Palestinian heritage to kind of, promote this political narrative that allows for their displacement, that allows, that promotes the opinion that Palestinians don't belong in Israel, that they are just, remnants of an Arab invasion that took over the land. And it's just not true. They're not Arab. They're Semitic, but they're not Arab, and they've been there since the ancient era.
So what's the lesson of history? It's that if you're going to take over a land, make sure you don't half-ass your genocide so no one comes back to claim your land back from you.
Another thing worth considering is, the fact that you're going to be treated completely different in the state of Israel based on your race. If you're Palestinian or Arab, or basically if you're not considered racially a Jew, you're going to be treated much differently, and you don't have the same rights based on your ethnicity, which is something that in the United States, I know that thankfully, we don't subscribe to that type of shit anymore. But anybody who supports that going on over there is, basically, perpetrating the same kind of nonsense that was going on officially, like through the state with Jim Crow and all kinds of shit like that for decades. Over 100, slavery, Jim Crow. So this is something else that the state of Israel has to answer for. Even if you say, well, they have a right to the land, they took it over fair and square, it's theirs now. You have to then try to deal with the fact that this is going on, still today.
I just think that they're just different. I believe it was Zetman who sent me, he sent me a link. It was a talk between a rabbi and a Jewish atheist. And he said the big difference between Jews, somewhat Muslims, and and Christians is that Christians proposed the separation of church and state. And what that did was it kind of separated the identity. So, uh, and this is why Christian persecution by quote unquote white people or white Christians is ignored in the Middle East or in Africa. So it's their Jews are different in that sense. They have their religion is their identity. You know, it's and the race is also plays a part in it. So it's again they're different people. Um, so yeah, our standards shouldn't apply to them and their standards. I guess. I mean, I support that kind of way of thinking. I think, like from a Christian perspective, we should also kind of emulate or kind of copy what the Jews are um, practicing because it would be also be beneficial for us. So I don't have a problem with that. It's their land; they can do whatever they want.
I'd just say, good luck moving to Japan as a non-ethno-Japanese and getting citizenship. People seem to be presuming that it's automatically immoral to have an ethno-state. Although Israel certainly does allow people to convert, and it isn't strictly ethnocentric, but to have some element of it. Well, if you allowed open immigration by anyone, it wouldn't take very long at all to be completely overwhelmed by Muslim populations who surround them and outnumber them by thousands and thousands of times. This is 0.2% of the world population that are trying to maintain their identity and have a home unique to them. Ideally, it wouldn't be where it is for practical purposes for world politics, but it is there.
I'm not talking about citizenship. I'm just talking about being able to walk down the street without being treated differently just because of the color of your skin.
It's not a color of the skin matter. There's all types of Jews in Israel. There's Ethiopian Jews. There's Russian Jews. Mizrahi Ashkenazi. So it's not a racial thing.
Sometimes it is. If I can speak, if somebody wants to speak, let me know. I'll stop. But there's for people that know Israel intimately, they know that within Israel a lot of racism goes on. When they tried to trace genetic link back to the ancient Israelis, they found that a lot of African population groups within Africa shared similar genes that they considered to be indicative of Jewish heritage. One such being Beta Israel. Now, Israel did a fantastic thing, a very heroic thing, and they airlifted a lot of the Beta Israelis out of Ethiopia who were suffering from famine and disease, and they brought them to Israel. But once they did, there was a large group of Orthodox Jews who were against it. They terrorized these people. They set a lot of the apartment buildings that these people lived in on fire. They vandalized their vehicles. And even after the state of Israel, because there had been Jews that actually continued to live in Israel since the ancient era, and they're known as the Mizrahim. Once the Ashkenazim and even the Sephardi's came back to Israel after the law of return was initiated, and after the creation of the state, the Ashkenazim kind of oppressed the Mizrahim and saw them as lesser Jews based on their darker skin color. They considered them less educated, less intelligent, and not fit to rule. The Sephardim, too, were discriminated against to a point, but they managed to rise and wrestle a little bit of control away from the Ashkenazim, and today they enjoy a good public representation. But even today, the Mizrahim Jews, who you could call Middle Eastern Jews, are still largely underrepresented and kind of oppressed within Israel. And it's based on skin color and race because the Mizrahim look more Middle Eastern. Their culture is more Middle Eastern, and they don't have the characteristics that the pale, blue-eyed Ashkenazim have, who came from Germany, Poland, and Russia.
I mean, that's all legitimate, but just point out that nearly every multi-ethnic nation has similar conflicts. And again, it seems like we're holding Israel to a different standard. And obviously, we would encourage them to have a more egalitarian view and improve as they move on. One of the troubles is how much political power the rabbinical class actually has in Israel. It's to the point now where if you don't enter the rabbinical class, there's no prayer of ever owning your own house in Tel Aviv and so on. And a lot of people feel very disenfranchised as secular Jews in Israel.
Well, again, I would say the double standard in this case, once again, is in favor of Israel. In the United States, we publicly decry racism. I know as an individual, I often speak against it. I'm very egalitarian and I believe in civil rights. And I think the United States, since the Civil War, has a long history of fighting for underprivileged people and minority rights, where very, very few people know of the discrimination that goes on in Israel. It's not widely publicized. So I do believe there's a double standard, as you say, but I think the double standard favors Israel.
There's racists in America, and there's racists in Israel, as you know. But on the state level, there are people who are black converts to Judaism, black converts who are allowed to move to Israel and settle there, and they're allowed to own homes there. So to me, it's not really. It's more of like you have like the general population. There's some segments who are racist, but that's the same in America. But on the state level, like you can convert to Judaism, be black, and move to Israel and own a home there. I don't see the what is it, the structural racism or the state sponsored racism.
This is actually true.
The whole Israel question too. I don't think anyone has really discussed. Of course, I came a little late, but I made it at least in time for the open discussion, and I didn't hear anybody talking about how one of the holiest sites in Islam, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, sits on what was also once the historical Temple of King Solomon site, and so that temple, the people in the Zionist movement want to rebuild that temple, and there's no way that temple is going to be rebuilt without destroying the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and something like that. I mean, if you think that tension in the Middle East has been a major issue, which it has for a long time, for many lifetimes, I foresee if something like that was actually undertaken, which I believe it will be eventually, because the Freemasons, all the people in the highest levels of power in the Western civilization are, I shouldn't say all of them, but many of them are pushing for that. So when and if that happens, you're going to see conflict like you've never seen before, and that may be World War III that you are bringing on, all in order to try to capture something, take it, give it to who it used to belong to. A lot of people are going to die, and a lot of innocent people are going to die just over a few meters of real estate. So, everybody that argues for this whole might makes right thing, I think that you're forgetting that that there are consequences to war, and there's consequences to that sort of attitude that that you shouldn't be ignoring.
I think honestly that would be it's a perfect opportunity for Christians, because the whole Christians, they almost blindly support Israel with nothing in return, or blindly support the Jews with nothing in return. But I think that's one of those cases where opportunity for the Christians to help the Jews accomplish that, rebuilding King Solomon Temple, and knowing how well the Jews are connected maybe they can kind of bankroll getting back Constantinople as well. So it would be a win-win. Just an idea I'm throwing out there.
Well, obviously, it would be a tremendous disaster if they knocked down a major Islamic site and put up the Jewish temple. I mean, it would become the number one terrorist target in the world overnight. But if you're wondering like why people are motivated to do it, the Temple of Solomon is the centerpiece of Jewish religion. You know, the whole instruction for animal sacrifice, for example, requires that you be at the temple. So the practice of sacrifice is suspended until the temple is rebuilt. So for people who actually are religious Jews, it's as if a major part of the religion is abolished by not having that temple there. So you can see why they'd be motivated to do so.
I personally don't mind. What goes around comes around, and you know, from a Christian perspective, I hope it happens.
So how do you address the fact that many innocent people will be killed just to try to assert dominance over a few square feet of land?
I think it's a terrible idea.
I mean, it's war. Sorry, but yeah,
and I think if they were planning on doing it, the time to do it would have been at the conclusion of one of the many defensive wars that Israel has fought. I think the fact that they haven't done it is pretty good sign they don't intend to.
I just think it's war. This is a conflict that has been going on for 1,200 years, and it's just, you know, like you said, if you're going to, I don't see this as a genocide. I see this as, you could say, revenge because Christians were attacked first. But you know, it is what it is. Collateral damage. I think that's the word that they use. But you know, yeah.
What you're advocating is going to be the most powerful recruiting tool for people who are terrorists and getting people who otherwise were not interested in being terrorists to become terrorists that you could ever possibly imagine. So you're basically begging for there to be more terrorism. I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying that actions have consequences, and you know, just this attitude of, well, this is war, all's fair in war. You know, over a few square feet of land, even like you're fine with that. So, you know, don't just leave well enough alone. Let's try to take a few more inches, and even if you know hundreds of thousands of innocents are killed, that's perfectly acceptable.
Yes, because in the long term, there won't be, you drastically reduce the chances of Christians being genocided by Muslims. So it's the same you know, way of thinking that it's the same reasoning the Jews used, you know, when they went back to Israel, because now they're prosperous. Initially, you know, many Jews died, so many Christians will die. So it is what it is. And like I said, if you want a permanent end to these problems, you have to fight the war. There's no point in going back and forth. It's just you know, there's just.
I just want to clarify that although the line is unclear, we are advocating for political violence on this server. So that would be a reminder that any kind of advocating for political violence is not something we want to do. So I won't say whether or not you've done that here. I'm not sure, but let's just make that clear. That being said, I think this has been a really great event on Israel. Does anyone want to give us one or two more comments before we close the recording?
I just wanted to say that nobody seemed to bat an eye at the Muslim policy of always fighting to reconquer any piece of land that they ever owned. And we seem to accept that as a given because it is a given. And we basically know we're not in the position to negotiate with Muslims over that policy. And it's only because Israel has shown a willingness to negotiate that we could even really have this conversation. And if Jews were as fanatical about it at large, then we would just accept that as an impossibility. So I think it's encouraging that there's a segment of the Jewish population that's willing to consider alternatives.
So again, is there anyone who'd like to take this opportunity to say one more closing thought about Israel before we close this really informative episode?
Israel is great.
Okay, well, that being said, I want to. I'm sorry, did you want to turn Captain Reality before we stop the podcast?
I'm sorry for talking over you. I just said they should be nicer to the Palestinians.
All right. Okay. I don't really have any closing statements other than that we should all remember that Judaism is many different things. It's an ethnicity, it's a nationality, and it's a religion. Some people are ethnically Jewish, some people are religiously Jewish, some people are both, some people are culturally Jewish. And none of these things, there's many different types of Judaism, Orthodox, Reform, Liberal, etc. And none of these things are synonymous necessarily with Zionism, which is a political project that overlaps with but is different than Judaism. So it's a complicated series of questions. And I think this has been a really good podcast. I learned a lot. A lot of you guys know a lot and told me a lot about this, so I'm grateful. Hopefully it's been informative for everyone else. It's been a wild ride. Israel is still here for the, it's not going anywhere, it would appear. So I think we did a good job digging into its history and its meaning today. So thank you very much, everybody. Let's jump up to the regular voice chat room. We'll having another great podcast tomorrow at 8 Central with Knights of the Round Table, Richard Dawson, and Surprise about MK Ultra, MK Austin, Project Artichoke, and other interesting CIA secret projects. We are the Roundtable Discord server. You can find us by Googling Roundtable Discord. You can find us through politics or conspiracy theories on Discord and on all social media. And our website is theroundtablediscord.com. See you guys upstairs. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Now the intermission commences.